Mr. Icken and Ms. Tillotson are going to give a brief update to council. We had a fairly extensive presentation on TERSs earlier in the year, and then there was some workshops provided to council members, those who wanted to have a more in-depth understanding of the way the TERSs work and what is possible and not possible with the dollars. They are a way to concentrate tax dollars in an area and do what the city would ultimately want to do anyway, which is invest in infrastructure, but they can allow us to accelerate those infrastructure investments. They allow us to leverage dollars from other taxing entities when those taxing entities have chosen to participate. And they constitute a significant portion of the CIP. I've heard some comments from some candidates for office recently about how we should do away with the TERSs. Doing away with the TERSs would essentially end the at least half, I would say, of the capital projects across the city of Houston, and pretty direct impact. One reason being that the revenue that goes through the TERSs is not counted against our revenue limitations. So doing away with the TERSs would simply do away with that revenue coming into the city of Houston. But Mr. Icken, Ms. Tillotson?
Thank you, Mayor. We are going to go through some specifics on TERSs here and show you some generalized numbers. Council has over the past 2 weeks and will over the course of the next few weeks be approving budgets and TERSs. Before we have come to council, we have come to every district council member to talk about the TERS within there, and certainly we have done what we want to do, which is engage district council members early on in this process of doing this. Mayor's correct. About a month ago, we came to Budget and Fiscal Affairs, and we talked about some plans for annexations of TERSs. We'll come back to that at the end of this conversation. There are some modest changes to several TERSs that we're going to be suggesting over the course of the next 2 months. The important point for council to know here is we are well within state guidelines of what we do, state law, but we will show you that at the end of this conversation. So with that, let me turn it over to Gwen to just, again, refresh a TERS workshop that I appreciate the council members that attended, and we got material out to you. We went through 3 2-hour sessions to just go over the fundamentals of TERSs and where we are. So we're going to repeat that very briefly in the first 2 charts and then get into some very specific numbers that have come out in public discussion recently.
Not the 2-hour version, the 10-minute version.
We have a 2-chart person here.
Next slide, please. So during the last couple of months, there's just been a lot of discussion about TERSs, and before we get into some of the more complex discussions regarding TERSs, I think it'll be helpful to make sure that everybody has a shared knowledge about what TERSs are, the increment specifically, and those factors that influence the increment. So I'm going to go through that real quickly. So what is a TERS increment? When TERSs are created, or TERSs are annexed into, or territories is annexed into existing TERSs, a base year is established. That base year means that all property taxes up to that base year valuation comes to the general fund. So that will always continue to come to the general fund, and the city will not lose any revenue from that. The amount of growth that happens after a base year is established is what we call the increment. And it is that increment that produces the revenue that goes to the TERSs that are appropriated annually to the TERSs. The reason that's very important is because I think there's a lot of discussion that the city loses out when these TERSs are created. We're going to be bringing some annexations and some new TERSs forward, and so I think it's really important for us to at least understand that basic fundamental. Another thing that's really important is there are multiple jurisdictions that participate in a TERS, and I think sometimes we lose the fact of that and what that means to the city, what that means to our ability to leverage other resources to build city assets. Up until 1999, school districts were able to participate and contribute to TERSs. After 1999, school districts are no longer able to contribute, but any TERS that was created prior to September 1, 1999, still continues to get the benefit of the revenue that is generated by school districts. So we also have access to property taxes from community colleges, property taxes from the county. So that's really important that we're not only getting city taxes, but other jurisdictions' revenue that we get to use for city assets. Not all increment that's generated goes directly to a tax increment reinvestment zone for projects. So, for instance, administrative costs gets taken away from that TERS increment. Also, affordable housing. For those TERSs that are participating in the affordable housing program, and many of them are, that gets set aside. That does not go to a TERS for projects. And then also any other services or purchases that the TERS has to make gets excluded. So the net of that increment is what goes to TERSs for their ability to build capital projects. The mayor mentioned earlier that TERS increment is not subject to Proposition 1. That simply means that we get to reduce the total taxes that have been collected by the amount of increment that's generated within these TERSs. The other cap that we continue to hear about is our 25% cap, and we had presented before that we were only at 14.02% of our 25% maximum. We recently annexed some territory. We're now at 14.04% of the 25% cap, which we will talk more about that when we talk about updating our matrix document. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important for us to kind of have a little bit of a conversation, or at least set the tone to talk about how TERSs are different from management districts. I think there's been a lot of confusion that TERSs and management districts are one and the same. We just sometimes use different terms to reference them, but they're very different entities. TERSs are created, as you know, the state gives us the authority, so it's legislatively controlled and governed, but the city of Houston through city council is the only entity that can create a TERS or influence the boundaries of a TERS. Unlike management districts are created by either the state or by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Those are the only two entities that have the authority to create a management district, although the city does have consent authority to consent to the creation of management districts in the same way that we have the ability to consent to the creation of municipal utility districts. So same general concept. Funding for TERSs, as I mentioned earlier, comes from the increment generated from property taxes through multiple jurisdictions, unlike the funding for management districts. Management districts are funding by an assessment that is imposed on primarily commercial property owners. So there is no tax, there is no impact to the city, there is no cost to the city when it comes to the funding source for management districts. Eligible projects, there are some similarity in the types of projects that a management district can implement as compared to a TERS, but primarily, especially the management districts that we work more closely with, the TERS is responsible for building the critical infrastructure. So TERS are building streets, TERS are building drainage projects, detention, water sewer projects, really critical projects, and then you have the relationship with the management district that typically, if there is a maintenance type of obligation or responsibility tied to that infrastructure, the management district will assume that maintenance obligation so that there is a shared or complementary relationship between TERSs and management districts. In terms of debt, of course, with TERSs, there is an establishment of redevelopment authorities. Redevelopment authorities have the ability to authorize debt, so they do and are responsible for issuing bonds, but so can the management districts. But if they issue any kind of debt or bond, they are going to use the assessments that they collect to securitize those bonds or debt instrument. A couple comments I just want to make about management districts. In addition to management districts having this responsibility for maintenance of TERS infrastructure projects, sometimes we overlook the fact that the management districts serve as the grantee in receiving grants from various different federal agencies. Those dollars that they receive actually go towards the construction of TERS projects. And so we have many instances, for instance, Upper Kirby Management District has secured over $12 million from the Federal Transit Administration, from TxDOT, to spend on TERS projects. And so when we talk about leveraging of funds, We're not only talking about leveraging funds that we receive from other taxing jurisdictions, but we're also talking about leveraging funds that we receive from federal agencies that we would not have access but for the management districts. Redevelopment authorities do not have the ability to serve as a grantee, so they cannot be awarded grant dollars. Next slide, please. So I want to spend a little time talking about the fund balance and what it is and what it is not. First of all, we are governed by, as a governmental entity, by the Governmental Accounting Standard Boards that defines the various categories that make up a fund balance. So when I talk about fund balance, what I'm referring to is I've had multiple meetings where we reviewed budgets. And if you recall the budget template and how that information and how the data flows, you have sources of revenues where you might have increment grants and other sources of revenues. You have your expenditures, you've got your CIP projects, you've got development agreements, all of those are cost against your resources. And at the very end of your budget template, you have something called ending fund balance. So what we've done is we've taken an aggregation of all of the ending fund balances for our 23 active TERS and we've aggregated it. So what you see here represents all of the TERSs. There are 4 categories of what we consider to be, we can call it a cash fund balance. Restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned. And we've identified the value that we have in each of those categories, but let me kind of give you a little bit of the definition of what those are. Restricted fund are funds that are restricted either legislatively or by external obligations or commitments that can only be used for certain types of uses. So for instance, debt service. When TERS issue bonds, they have a legal contractual obligation to service that annual bond debt. They have to have that money set aside, not only the actual annual debt service, but also the reserves that may be required. In most cases, the coverage rate is about 25%, but it could be higher. So TERS have to have that. It's a cash, but it's restricted and can only be used for that purpose. In addition, projects that are to be used from those proceeds that are identified in the bond application is also restricted. So not only the proceeds come in, but if there are 3 or 4 projects, specific projects identified, then the proceeds can only be used for those projects. Cannot be just willy-nilly spent on whatever the TERS or the TERS board decides to spend it on. They've got an obligation to spend on those projects. Affordable housing, which we talk about a lot, is a legislative restricted use of fund balance. The next category is committed funds, and these represents projects that have been approved by the TERS board through a contract. So they've already secured a contract to implement a project. So there's an obligation to satisfy that contract with that contractor. So those funds may be available. In some cases, it takes multiple years to do a project. So even though it may be sitting in a cash account, those funds are committed to that contractor. Also through development agreements. And so when a board approves a developer agreement, they are approving to satisfy the cost associated with the infrastructure that the developer might construct through the increment that is generated. So that is committed. Assigned is projects, most TERS have a long-term plan, but what we bring before council is a 5-year CIP. So if there are projects that are going to be constructed in the next year, we have the ability to assign costs or funds from one budget year into the very next year. So there is an assignment. Those dollars are planned specifically for a project and is identified in the first year. If the project is going to extend beyond a year, then those funds are captured in unassigned or unrestricted. It's still not a cash on hand. It's just that those dollars are going to be spent more than 1 year out. So those are the general definitions. And so we've captured here that we have $318 million in our ending fund balance, of which $129 million is restricted. We have the detail of all of these numbers if the council members are interested. Then we've got our committed, there's about $49 million of committed funds. Assigned is $81.7 million, and unassigned is about $58 million. Just to give you an example, in that unassigned, there's $58 million, of which $12 million is unassigned by Upper Kirby. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is unassigned by Icken. $12 million is unassigned by Mayoral. $12 million is u In the very next year, so in fiscal year 15, you will see where 12 million has been allocated to CIP projects. So Westheimer, Bissonnette, Intercity Complex will show 12 million that carry forward from FY14 into FY15. So we continue to make assignments, and many of these TERSs are trying to be strategic and planning as far out as they can, but they're limited to the resources that they have, and so in some cases you have to further out projects.